My detective slammed the phone down on his desk. "Rudy's getting fucking drug court," he snarled. To say the detective was unhappy was an understatement. He was furious. Rudy was a drug dealer, and a pretty prolific drug dealer at that. For the last several years, Rudy had been sending his relatives from Detroit into our little city to deal as much crack cocaine and pills that he could get his hands on. Close to 50% of the trafficking in our city could be attributed to his family enterprise. We locked up all of his associates, cousins, and family we could get our hands on. Rudy had been the focus of our narcotics investigations for almost 2 years. Finally, the detectives had taken down so many of his relatives that Rudy himself was going to have to make a run to town to re-up his dealers. This was the culmination of years of work, and the detectives were ready. The takedown was almost textbook. Almost. Rudy managed to make the undercover cars at the last minute, and he fled. The pursuit lasted for over 20 minutes and went to the neighboring county with contraband flying out the windows. In the end, he was arrested and locked up facing dozens of major felony narcotics possession and trafficking charges. It was a good win. And then the judges got involved. In the early 2000s, drug courts became very popular in the United States. The drug court concept revolves around taking a treatment approach instead of an enforcement approach to get drug addicts into long-term treatment and care. Instead of punishment, their purpose is to address one of the underlying drivers of crime and, in the process, reduce the use of imprisonment, potentially leading to substantial cost savings. Drug courts aim to do this by incentivizing or mandating offenders into addiction treatment combined with frequent drug testing and regular monitoring by the judge. This concept, along with others, were just some of the first steps into decarceration and legalization of minor crimes. Whether the idea has merit or not is beside the point. The program was designed for addicts to get help, not to free drug dealers. Our judge saw it differently. Against all of the guidance and program guidelines, a violent career criminal was allowed to stay out of jail as long as he passed the drug screenings and showed up to court. Rudy wasn't a user. He was a dealer. 1 week after Rudy started drug court, his relatives started showing back up into town dealing. After all, when there's no consequences for committing crimes, why stop? It's time to start telling our own stories. I'm Steve Kellums, and welcome to Blue Canary. Rick Snyder started in law enforcement over 27 years ago and continues to serve on a major metropolitan police department. Rick is the president of Fraternal Order of Police Lodge 86 and also serves as the National FOP Chaplain. Rick has been vocal about the issues involving police reform for many years, and I was pleased to have an opportunity to talk to Rick about the state of policing and the war on cops. Rick, thanks for coming on and talking with me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to be with you.
You know, I should say that I have been listening to you on the news for quite some time, talking about a lot of the same things that have been bothering me and bugging me over the last several years. And that was the reason I wanted to have you on and talk to you. But before we get too far down that road, can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved in law enforcement and how you got involved in the FOP and making and talking about these things at a big level?
Yeah, well, I actually started in law enforcement about 27 years ago now, and had the opportunity to get hired and work at a major metropolitan police department in the state of Indiana. And I've been able to work in just about really every area that you can think of within law enforcement, including patrol operations and criminal investigations, but also administration and training. And as a result of that, I have a pretty well-rounded perspective on law enforcement in general, and could see a lot of the things and the changes that were starting to occur within the profession, and more importantly, management oversight, but also the political influences into the profession. And I would say probably around 2010, so now probably 13 to 15 years ago, I would say, and started going down the route of being able to be a voice and speak out for my fellow officers through the Fraternal Order of Police. And as a result of that, I've spent several years now working. I really started working on labor agreements and contracts first. That was really the way to dip the toes in the water, and quickly found out that was jumping in to the deep end by far. But behind the scenes and those behind the closed door conversations you're able to have through those negotiations was able to see a lot of the positive but also negative influences that were at hand. And so I dove into that even further. And now in my fifth term as a local FOP president. And then as a result of that, through a lot of unexplainable things and transitions that have occurred, I have been asked to serve as our national chaplain for the National FOP for the last 2+ years. And that actually has been one of the greatest blessings in my life.
It's probably very eye-opening too, with the number of officers killed in the line of duty and having to serve at that level and with that duty. I'm sure that's difficult.
It's difficult and rewarding all at the same time. I think it's more of an honor, I would say, because you have the opportunity and the capacity to walk alongside families from all over this country who have lost their loved ones in the line of duty. And every year we have our National Law Enforcement Memorial during Police Week in Washington, D.C. What sometimes folks, even within law enforcement, forget is that all culminates into the National Law Enforcement Memorial, which is held on the grounds of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and that is hosted and facilitated by the National Fraternal Order of Police. So in those services, you have the opportunity within the role of the national chaplain to lead our nation in prayer during that service. And the perspective that you get from that is unbelievable, because oftentimes that is the ceremony that the President of the United States attends in recognizing law enforcement and the sacrifice of all these families. And you usually have anywhere from 30 to 40,000 family members, fellow law enforcement officers, and other attendees there on the grounds. And so from that presidential podium, you're looking straight down the Washington Mall and looking at all these families that are hurting and in need. And you realize in that moment in time, you're there for God to speak through you and offer words of comfort, but also restoration. And that is a great, great honor and something that I don't think anyone takes lightly. And I know I definitely do not.
If anyone has not had the opportunity, any of the officers out there that have not gone to that memorial, seen those walls, and then if you can attend that ceremony, it's one of those very sobering moments that you're going to have in your life. And I highly recommend for people to make that journey. I know that for me, I haven't had an opportunity to attend the vigil. I've watched it several times, but I have had an opportunity to walk through that monument, to find my friends on that wall. And that was important to me, and I think it's important to a lot of people.
Well, it's one of those things that it leaves a lasting impression. The interesting perspective is that National Law Enforcement Memorial Wall that is there in Washington, D.C., it's the only living monument in the District of Columbia. Now think about that for a second. So many times people think about things like the Vietnam Wall and other war memorials and monuments to the fallen in our military and other things. The National Law Enforcement Memorial Wall is the only living monument that continues to have names added to it annually within the District of Columbia. And what's striking is that now when you go to the wall, if you haven't been there for probably just the last couple of years, they have actually installed new panels to the wall. So if you've been there and the wall is there, and it's two walls that face one another around a sphere, if you will, of trees and whatnot. But they have now added panels on top of that wall to extend the wall. Those panels are blank. And when you stand there and look at them, it hits you that they're there for more names to be added in the future years. We're running out of room on the existing wall. And what I share with many people is that as a law enforcement officer, you stand there and you look at that, and what moves you is all the names that will be added, but it also hits you, it could be yours. And it reminds you of the significance of why we do that and have that wall.
Absolutely. That was my focus for this podcast this season, is I wanted to start talking about the war on cops. And many people like to say that doesn't exist and that there's nothing going on out there unusual. But those of us who are in this field, those of us who are keeping our eyes and ears open, recognize that there's something very disturbing going on right now.
Well, absolutely. Now, it depends on how you look at it as to what the causes are for that and what the sources are for that. And there's a myriad of them. But from a faith perspective, which a lot of times I find folks within our profession aren't always geared or amped up to talk about, I think what you quickly realize is when you understand the fundamentals of what is going on, you see that this is a spiritual battle that is occurring. And it's the women and men in law enforcement who are on the front lines of that spiritual battle. And so what we're finding is that when you do have those conversations within the profession, folks connect to it very quickly once they get over the hump. Most people think, well, here comes Snyder or whoever, they're coming in here to thump a Bible and wave it in my face and all these other things, but nothing can be further from the truth. What we talk about, though, is that as a profession, we talk about spiritual things all the time, right? We talk about the warrior spirit. We talk about the guardian spirit. We put all these labels on the approaches that we take and the responses that we have. But when you dig down and drill down into them, invariably what you're going to find is you're really having an overall spiritual and faith discussion. It drives you back to a reminder of why is it you do what you do. And that's a powerful discussion that we have all the time around this country, is driving our officers back to their purpose. And when you do that, we quickly see that it's rooted in these spiritual foundations.
I again couldn't agree more. It was why I wanted to talk with you, because you put it in words. I sometimes put them in different words, but we're talking about the exact same things, having to make sure that we understand our professionalism, our ethics, our backgrounds, and the love that we have for our communities and the people that we serve, and how we carry that over into our communities. And I think that the opposite of that, those that we tend to be dealing with regularly, like the defund the police movements, like some of the political movements, anti-police movements, they really are coming at this very differently, obviously, but their actions that sometimes, and I do think that at some level, they just don't realize what they're doing. But some of those actions, particularly let's talk about the defund police movement, has caused some real issues in our profession and the ability to keep our communities safe.
Well, no doubt about that. And what you invariably find is that when you dig into the actual circumstances of what's going on and the facts of what's going on, I mean, one of the things that we talk about a lot is we're constantly told about what lives matter. What we have said is that facts matter. And when you start driving into the facts of what is occurring, it becomes pretty apparent pretty quickly what's behind a lot of what's going on. And so here again, that's the purpose in what we are doing, which is reminding our officers of that. And when you pull back and kind of peel the layers of the onion away, you quickly see that what this is about is destabilization by design. And it's one of the things that we've been talking about now since at least 2019. A lot of people don't know until they hear about it, but it was there were national interviews that were done about it, and I participated in some of those. But the Fraternal Order of Police, leaders from major cities all around the country, were called and invited to the White House by then President Donald Trump in 2019. It was December 2019. So think about that in the context of things, just the timeline of events that occurred after December 2019. And the question that was posed to us is, what the heck is going on in our major cities across this country? Well, the things that we talked about were showing and demonstrating from the frontline perspective what was occurring in real time and what we saw as law enforcement leaders that was over the horizon and coming our way. And what was different was we were projecting that a lot of the things that we saw occur in 2020, we were foreseeing occurring naturally probably around 2022. They were about 2.5 years out. But no one could have predicted the events in May of 2020 and what took place. But the results that occurred were the exact things that we were discussing that were coming our way by very intentional designs, very intentional steps that were being taken. And when we walked out of that meeting, we stood outside the West Wing. In the interview that I did, the statement that I made was that what we were seeing in major cities across our country in 2019 was that we were decriminalizing our criminals at the same time we were depolicing our police, and that is a recipe for disaster. Well, now take a look at what we've seen transpire. I would suggest to you that the hypothesis that we put forward in 2019 is exactly what we have now experienced in the years that have followed for the next 3 years. And we're continuing to see that.
Many of those arguments, the defund police arguments that, well, we don't mean defund. We just need to transfer some of their duties to other people. We've shown that while some of those ideas may be great in conjunction with law enforcement, not in replacement of, and by taking away those law enforcement, when you defund, when 90% of police budgets are in salaries, defund means less police officers. So now we don't have police officers on the streets out there doing the things they need to do. And on top of that, we have this huge political movement taking place within our judges and within our prosecutors across the United States that are basically making criminal offenses legal. I read an article this morning about someone who was responsible for raping 4-year-olds and 9-year-olds that only got 180 days in jail. Well, when there's no consequences, it becomes a societal norm, and that carries over for the entire country.
Well, that is the issue at hand. And so that's why we've said, people say, well, why on earth would people take intentional steps to decriminalize the criminals, depolice the police? Well, the point that I have consistently made, which is if you break it, you can remake it. And that is the crux of what is really going on. And so we're unabashed in terms of talking about that. The one thing that we have on our side is the facts and unfortunately the experiences. So the warnings that have been provided have proven out to be true. Now you point back to those and show exactly how that has transpired. And the worst part in all of that is this, and it's the point that we keep making, is that it's the folks who are the most marginalized in our communities who suffer the most. So in major cities like Indianapolis, Indiana, where 3 out of every 4 homicide victims are our fellow Black neighbors, don't tell me Black Lives Matter, yet there's nothing that you're saying about the victimization of our fellow neighbors in the community at a disproportionate rate. In Indianapolis, as an example, and it's the same thing that you see play out in many major cities across this country. In Indianapolis, Black residents make up nearly 28 to 30% of the population, yet they're averaging 75 to 80% of our homicide victims. What I have said is that should be a red flag to everyone in our community, that whoever is being disproportionately impacted and victimized as a result of violent acts, we should be pulling out all the stops to get at the heart of the matter and start to address that. And what you're going to find is that a lot of times, many of our victims and our suspects, when they are known, have records, criminal convictions, and arrest histories that show that if one or both of them had been held accountable for prior bad acts, one or both of them could not be present for that latest act of victimization to occur. So if we're going to talk about lives mattering, we should say if we had efforts and opportunities to intervene and prevent that death from occurring, should we not be sitting around the table and working backwards from that event to find out where the gaps occurred and then fill those gaps so that we can prevent the future deaths that we know are coming our way? Now, what's been unbelievable to witness is that the stakeholders and decision makers that you see on TV talking about what lives matter, or talking about defunding the police, or talking about criminal justice reforms, absolutely refuse to get around the table to talk about how to provide solutions to prevent those deaths from occurring. That is the tragedy, and quite frankly, that's the wickedness that we see firsthand on display. And that's been occurring for us since at least 2019. It was really going on before that, but there was a ramp-up period where special interest groups were attaching themselves onto governmental entities and governmental decision makers, such as prosecutors, judges, the public defender's office, and really forcing this discussion of quote-unquote criminal justice reforms. Now, I'll belabor this just a little bit more. I don't want to take up all your time, but it's important that folks understand the context. Law enforcement is not against criminal justice reforms. In fact, it was the National Fraternal Order of Police that really got the criminal justice reform package over the goal line by then President Donald Trump, which was the largest criminal justice reform package in our nation's history. And that was not going to happen. And the National FOP stepped in, worked with our legislative elected officials, and got that done. So nothing could be further from the truth on providing reforms, but it's important to note we're not talking about low-level first-time offenders. We're talking about repeat violent offenders. And the fact that there's a revolving door that's been intentionally created within our criminal justice system should be concerning to everyone in communities because everyone becomes affected. But I go back to my original point. It's the most marginalized that are affected the most and bear the greatest consequences. And that's what we've seen play out all across the United States.
When we talk about those offenders who should be in jail, who should be in prison and weren't, that hit pretty hard in central Indiana last year. We had a couple of incidents in where officers were killed in the line of duty by offenders that by any reason should have been in prison.
Well, absolutely. And see here again, that's the thing is we get real time, real world outcomes that highlight and prove the point. And then we have the opportunity to point back to that. Now, you in law enforcement, how many times officers find themselves on a homicide scene, they're standing over a dead body in the middle of the street, shaking their head and saying, how the heck did we get here? Because they know that victim laying on the street because perhaps they've arrested them 5, 6, 10, 12 times before and know for a fact that had they have been held accountable for those prior bad acts, they couldn't be laying there on the street tonight. And again, this is what we always say is that law enforcement officers, this isn't a thing where we're making it personal, where, agenda-driven groups will try to make it out that officers just want to lock everybody up and throw away the key. Nothing could be further from the truth. But for those repeat violent offenders, we know the propensity for them to become a victim of the violence or a suspect in that violence down the road surges the more that accountability is reduced for them for those prior bad acts. So if we truly care about their lives, we truly care about helping to restore them, transform them, and get them back on the right path so that they can be a productive citizen, that means you have to have strong accountability for those violent interactions. But yet we have people who are intentionally, not by happenstance, not just naturally, organically occurring, but intentionally destabilizing the system and creating the revolving door that then leads to those deaths. That's why we say today they could be the suspect, tomorrow they're the victim. Either way, the community suffers at the loss of lives. And I think what it absolutely highlights is this overwhelming sense of a reduction in terms of the care for and the value that's placed on the sanctity of life. Take a look around your country, and I think you'll see that prove out.
We talk about, well, I think one of the things that frustrates me a lot is the anti-police movement will make a lot of statements, and they make these blue sky statements. This is, that is, and everything they're saying is a lie because the data proves the exact opposite. They refuse to look at any of the data. They refuse to come to the table for conversations. They simply lie over and over again. And those lies get pushed in a variety of different ways, whether they be through celebrities, through media, and even the politicians. Things like incarceration does not work. Things like the police are ineffective. But the statistics have proven time and time again that those two things they do work, that the law enforcement does work. And how do you as an advocate, how do you combat those people that are refusing to discuss facts and truth?
Well, the biggest thing that we do is we don't get bogged down in trying to prove a negative, right? I think that's the biggest mistake that is often made. And if people want to see that, take a look around social media, right? You watch people spin their wheels on Facebook trying to disprove things or prove a negative, and it's a worthless endeavor. What we have said is we just stay focused on outcomes. I'll give you an example. We proposed in 2019 going into 2020 that the capital city of the state of Indiana impanel what we called a Commission on Criminal Justice Outcomes. And we proposed to simply do what I was just talking about, get the major stakeholders involved in that process around a table, take real-time violent crimes that result in death, serious bodily injury. So we said take homicides, non-fatal shootings, non-fatal stabbings, work backwards from those events, identify where the gaps in the system occurred. Invariably, you're going to have an incident where people with no prior criminal history commit a crime, a violent crime, a crime of passion, whatever the case may be. We know that's going to happen. But that is a minimal number. The vast majority of these are a long history and pattern of criminal violence that keeps increasing over time. And you can clearly see where the gaps occur and where people were cycled right through the system and back into your neighborhoods. That's the key factor. They're not going into a halfway home. They're not going into some other facility. They're coming right back into your neighborhoods to wreak havoc again. Well, what do we see at the same time? You see that the trust and respect for the system, and specifically for law enforcement, nosedive. Why? Well, if you're that resident in the neighborhood and you have a violent crime that occurs, or perhaps you're the victim of a violent crime, and you watch the uniformed law enforcement officer respond to that, you watch them make the arrest, you watch them take this alleged suspect to jail, and the next day you see that suspect back in your neighborhood, how likely are you to cooperate with that investigation? How likely are you to call the police again? How likely are you to trust and respect the police? By the way, the most visible representation of government is the uniformed law enforcement officer. We're the only ones in the neighborhoods 24 hours a day. It isn't your mayor. It isn't your governor. It isn't that judge in the black robe. It's not your prosecutor. It's a uniformed law enforcement officer. So they are the ones that get left holding the bag for something they don't do. They've done their job. It's the rest of the system that needs to do theirs. And when they don't, the trust and respect for law enforcement plummets and goes through the floor. Well, then you start seeing this circular devolution, if you will, where we're swirling the drain in our communities because folks won't cooperate with the police. The police can't complete the steps they need to ensure successful prosecution. At the same time, the police are being kneecapped and having their legs cut out from underneath them by the very system they're the gatekeepers to, which is the criminal justice system. So if the rest don't do their jobs, the police are forced to continue to address the same issues and the same people, by the way, over and over again until it results tragically in a death or a serious bodily injury. That's not just for the residents. That's for the officers involved as well. And that's why you've seen officer line of duties and line of duty injuries skyrocket through the roof over the last several years, matching that same trend line of criminal victimization in our communities.
Rick had so much more to say, but due to technical difficulties and schedule conflicts, we had to postpone the second part of the interview. Don't worry though, Rick will be back on and we'll dig deeper into the issues at a later date, because that's the story we have to tell. Thank you for joining. As always, I'm curious what questions you're getting asked. What isn't the news covering? What story needs to be told? Connect with me at bluecanarypodcast@gmail.com.